So good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. I, of course, am Triggerman 1976, and welcome back to this live episode of the BlogCast, which is only on Rumble. If you're watching this live, I want to thank you for tuning in. And if you're watching this on replay, what's wrong with you? I know it's because I don't have a regular schedule, but I'm glad you're watching it anyway. First, thank you. Please be sure and hit that like button. If you're watching this for the first time, please especially hit that like button. If you're a returning viewer and aren't already subscribed, then please hit that subscribe button. And don't forget that you can also follow me on X and Instagram at Triggerman1976, the links to which are in the link tree in the description, where you also find my bookstore, where you can find many of the resources that I use. And purchases from the store help me, and they will help you with good deals. Now, two items that you can find there, especially that will help me directly, of course, is my debut novel, A Turning of Shadow, which is an action thriller, and a extended essay, Creation as Creed, which deals with the issue of creation, evolution, and biblical truth. The novel is both available in paperback and Kindle, but the essay is available in Kindle only at the moment. So now we get that housekeeping out of the way. A few weeks ago, Michaela Peterson hosted on her podcast Wes Huff, who is currently the vice president of Apologetics Canada and is a PhD candidate in New Testament studies at the University of Toronto. Wesley burst onto the scene just a year and a half ago in October of 24 when he debated Billy Carson, who has been described as a biblical conspiracy theorist, and to say that the debate went badly for Billy is just a little bit of an understatement, and it would be kinder to say that Billy dove unknowingly headfirst into a wood chipper. Now, I have both of these, the interview and the debate, linked in the description below, as well as the link, so you can look this up. Also have a kind of a outline of the debate linked down there as well, so be sure and check that out. It's in the description. Now, one thing that I noticed in light of Wes's meteoric rise in name recognition is that he has attracted a lot of attention, both positively and negatively. The question is why? And I'll give you two reasons. First, just look at this guy. He's gorgeous.
Ha! Gay!
I mean, as much as we like good looking people and we like for good looking people to succeed, we also secretly hate them. But there's more. He's more than just a pretty face. He's actually also pretty smart and articulate. I mean, he's almost what you would call a total package. He's got a very interesting story. I encourage you to kind of look into his background. He was paralyzed at a young age and made a full miraculous recovery. God has definitely blessed him. Now, of course, he's faced some legitimate criticism in some of his presentations where he doesn't necessarily go into great detail on subjects, and he tends to kind of speak in broad generalizations in some of his presentations. But when you don't really know your audience, generalization is just a good rhetorical tool where you can kind of introduce your audience to a subject, and especially if you aren't certain about their depth of knowledge, if you're not really doing a very pointed presentation, perhaps your interest isn't necessarily piqued by the subjects you may have that you're speaking on, and there may be some ancillary or some things that kind of intersect where you just have a general familiarity with them. I mean, I've run into this myself with things, so I'm willing to whatever criticism can be rightly warranted. I'm willing to let it slide, but others aren't. Others like Paul Ens, probably you better know him as Paulogia on YouTube. Now, he specifically takes issue with Wes's appearance on Mikhaila Peterson's podcast in this video. So, as part of Wes's appearance on that show, it was to announce the fact that he was joining what her father has established this thing called the Peterson Academy. He's joined as a lecturer.
Like I said, I'm really glad you came to teach. I think people on the platform are going to be absolutely thrilled. And I've heard good things from everybody who was there. What made you decide to agree to teach at Peterson Academy?
It's a good question. I mean, I think you guys are doing something that's novel. I think you're tapping into something as someone who has a broader kind of exposure to the academic world. I think that traditional academia could very well be in trouble because of a number of factors. But I think that there's room for broadening the categories of how we educate people.
Of course, Wes, if this happens to find its way to you, I want to say congratulations. It seems like a great opportunity. I hope you're able to make the most of it. I hope it works out well for you and that you have great success in that endeavor. But what's the issue with Paul or Apologia, you might ask?
So I do comparative analysis with a number of ancient literary works. But then because my area is it's New Testament studies formally, but it kind of crosses over into early church history and then kind of broader antiquity in general, I get away with talking about a bunch of different stuff.
Wow, okay. That's very niche. That's cool though. Just based on the text, like from a historian's perspective, how does the Bible compare to other ancient documents that we do trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what we mean when we say trust and compare. Like, I think,
Sounds like my dad.
yeah, that's right.
Pulling that out here.
But I think the definitions matter in the sense of how we're defining those categories. When we're talking about someone like Alexander the Great, we're waiting about 450 years between when he lived and when our first kind of comprehensive biographical material comes up. So there's a
Oh,
guy named Arrian who wrote our first kind of comprehensive biography.
So West came across as someone who gives careful nuance by asking for the definitions of trust and compare. But he slides in the phrase comprehensive biographical material here so that he can be technically correct in the sentence he's saying, while simultaneously being blatantly deceptive about the point he's trying to make.
So, my issue with this is if you're going to claim that Wes is being blatantly deceptive by being technically correct and by the fact that Wes uses the term comprehensive biographical material, then you got to be able to back it up. You've got to be able to bring some meat to this claim, or you're just engaging in whatever it is that Paul engages in. But I'm going to let him continue.
Yes, the earliest surviving full length narrative accounts of Alexander's life are from writers like Arrian in the 2nd century CE, writing about 450 years after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. And there are others like Plutarch, Diodorus Siculus, Quintus Curtius Rufus, and Justin.
All right, so let's talk about some of these names that Paul's dropped in here. Of course, there's Plutarch. Plutarch lived in the middle of the 1st century to the first third of the second. Now, his primary concern was people, not necessarily events. This is specifically emphasized by what he's really noted for, which is a set of biographies known as parallel lives. And with that, he uses a lot of anecdotes and some artistic license to create a set of neat comparisons between historic figures, hence the term parallel lives. One of those examples is his Life of Alexander, where he places Alexander in parallel with Julius Caesar, and it serves as more of a psychological study of the subjects rather than necessarily an actual like biographical recounting. While it does give us, it really contains a lot of questionable information that really doesn't appear in any other source, which prompts one to ask if the events described are real or if they're created for the purpose of the narrative that Plutarch is telling. Another person, of course, that he mentions is Diodorus Siculus. Diodorus lived in the 1st century BC and is probably best known for his work Bibliotheca Historica, which includes a rather sizable section on Alexander the Great, but it focuses more on his campaigns and battles and not on Alexander personally or in any comprehensive sense. Now, what about Quintus Curtius Rufus? He lived in the 1st century and is credited with writing the work Histories of Alexander the Great. As a matter of fact, he seems to be the one who coins the term Alexander the Great. It's a fragmentary work, and it appears to be one of the few sources that reproduces material from what was known as Alexander's day journal. And this was a record of Alexander's exploits during his expeditions. Again, not necessarily a comprehensive biography of the man. Lastly, he mentions Justin, who lived in the 2nd century. He is best known for his abridgment of Papias Trogus's massive work on the Macedonian Empire, which was titled The Epitome of the Philippic History of Pompeius Trogus. Here again, we have a focus on Alexander that's primarily around the circumstances leading up to his death. So, again, not necessarily a comprehensive biographical source. More importantly, these sources would be considered a secondary source at best or a tertiary source at worst. Now, what do I mean by this? When we talk about types of sources in history, we have primary sources, which would be things like letters, diaries, official reports, anything that directly connects to a person or to an event. And then there's secondary sources. Secondary sources are often built on the foundation of those primary sources and are coordinations and interpretations of the primary sources. These are often referred to what we would call historiography. And then lastly, there are tertiary sources. These are the sources that use elements in the secondary sources to produce a synthetic narrative of events and do so by reference to those secondary sources, often naming them. Now, why do I mention this? Hold on.
However, Arrian explicitly relied on much earlier sources, especially works by Ptolemy Soter, Aristobulus of Cassandria, Nearchus, and Callisthenes. Most of these earlier works are now lost, but we know they existed because later authors quote, discuss, and sometimes disagree with them.
Now, what's interesting is these are many of the same sources that Plutarch, Diodorus, Quintus Rufus, and Justin either directly or what modern scholars have detected by examining that there's similarity in the reference. Now, does this prove that Wes is being? None of this actually proves that Wes is being blatantly deceptive. But what we do have is Paul bursting into the scene, throwing dirt, and being generally disruptive when it comes to dealing with these texts. Now, Paul does mention that Arrian tends to engage in a type of source criticism, but then he complains.
And unlike the so called biographies of Jesus, Arrian actually names and evaluates his sources. He repeatedly tells readers when Ptolemy and Aristobulus agree or disagree, and explains why he trusts one source over another. The Gospel authors don't identify their sources in this way, which means historians can scrutinize Arrian more directly than they can the Gospels.
That's because Arrian is what is known as a tertiary historical source. That's because they can scrutinize him only as far as he intersects with sources like Plutarch, Diodorus, Quintus Rufus, or Justin, because the primary source texts are lost. But the Gospels aren't tertiary sources. It could be argued that they fall either into a category of primary or secondary sources, depending on how we qualify them. Well, why is this? Well, two very quick evidences. The first, of course, is from John's Gospel, where the Gospel of John ends with this double testimony. This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. So this is first a testimony of an eyewitness, and with a backup of a secondary endorsement of his statement. Now, the Gospel of Luke begins with a similar testimony, Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses, ministers of the word, had delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you might have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. From a source critical perspective, this, in terms of historical sources, that's about as definitive as one can get to being able to classify at least John and Luke as primary John and secondary when it comes to Luke. The fact that they don't actually name, that Luke doesn't actually give a name to sources, is kind of irrelevant to the fact that he mentions that he is deferring to sources, specifically eyewitnesses, which would be more in line with the type of literature that they tend to behave like. But then Paul says this. Now, the reason why I'm throwing this in here, I want this to be in your mind, because just remember that the instant that he does it, if he ever appeals to any biblical text to evidence a claim, he's just hung himself up by his own petard. Now, this is the reason why. You can't have it both ways. And you don't get to mock someone for appealing to a biblical text to evidence a claim and then turn around and appeal to the biblical text to evidence a claim. The sword cuts both ways. Now, whether the situations are analogous between the gospel and Arian's work, that's something of a subjective judgment, in my opinion, because we are talking about two different types of literature, because Arian's work is presented in terms of being a history, while the gospel fits into a particular literary category known as bioi, which was a popular level character study of an individual. Now, Richard Burridge has discussed this in his study, What Are the Gospels? The lines between genres are sometimes arbitrarily drawn by scholars because ultimately it is the author who is creating the work, and he determines how he wishes to present his materials. And the ancient rules of rhetoric need to be understood more as guidelines than hard and fast prescriptive rules. Now, if you just watch like the first 10 minutes of Michaela's interview with Wes, you'll notice that Wes is making some very generalized statements about the subject of historical reliability. And before he appears to be prepared to go into greater detail, but that's before Michaela takes the discussion into a different direction. Now, the whole reason that Wes is saying what he's saying about historical sources is very similar to a point that I made in this video, where I point out that if you're going to make historical claims that contradict another historical claim, then you better have some evidence to support it of a similar quality. This video is, of course, linked down in the description. Please be sure and check it out. Now, the specific example that Wes appeals to is the fact that the Gospels, all of which are written within a few decades of the event, all contend that Jesus was crucified, while the Quran, written hundreds of years later, claims that he wasn't. So the question is, which one are we going to trust? Now, the analogy that Wes is aiming at isn't necessarily between the Gospels and Arian's biography, but between the types of historical claims in Arian about Alexander versus any claims in any other surviving source. Now, the reason that Paul doesn't seem to understand the argument that Wes is making and has to attack such a straw man is because he's just got a need.
I feel the need.
And it's a visceral desire to attack rather than to understand. That he will literally grab onto any passing comment and make that the point rather than attempting to understand the actual argument being made and respond to it in a positive manner. Now, I know we've spent a lot of time so far actually going through everything that Paul brings up at the beginning of his video, and we've kind of been demonstrating that he's depending on his audience really being gullible dupes who don't actually know anything about the subject of historiography and gauging historical sources. Now, I have to ask, when it comes to that, who's really being blatantly deceptive? And knows his audience won't check on him, won't even do the slightest bit of double checking. What's the best way to answer this question? I think it's to look at how Paul responds to a question that Mikhaila asks toward the end of the interview, which is what becomes the title for the interview itself. What is the best evidence for the resurrection?
Best historical evidence for the resurrection.
Oh, okay. Best historical evidence for the resurrection. I mean, I take kind of a cumulative approach to the resurrection, in that one of the best pieces of evidence that I think speaks to the tangibleness of the resurrection is that you and I, Mikhaila, are talking about it 2,000 years later.
Yeah.
In that there are other messianic movements in the ancient world, but I bet you couldn't name any of the individuals involved in those.
No slight to Mikhaila, as it's just not her field of interest or study, but I don't think she could name 6 of the 12 disciples, or even list the books of the Bible, even though she professes to be a Christian. Her personal ability to name messianic movements in the ancient world isn't really evidence of anything, Wes.
It's also not the point, is it, Paul? I mean, it's not at all the point.
And there's a reason why we're asking questions about Jesus of Nazareth and not Simon Bar Kokhba. And that's because Simon Bar Kokhba led a revolt and died, and his movement died with him. And so I think there's something unique about the movement of Jesus that requires an explanation for what's going on.
Yes. What's unique is that it's popular.
Popular when? I mean, you can say that it's popular now, but then that's not Wes's argument at all. And Paul seems to miss the fact that Wes is pointing out that it's something about Jesus, not merely with regard to his teaching or his historical existence, that is driving this movement forward. Some unquestionable historical event that pushes it forward for 2,000 years, even though there were other movements that we know about through the historical record that are not merely overshadowed by it, but essentially erased from historical consciousness in comparison. But I'm going to let him continue.
Not that it's supernatural. We can explain why Christianity is popular without requiring that a resurrection happened. Popularity is incredibly common. There are many things in human history that became popular that are based on lies or mistakes. It's also common that out of any collection of like concepts, groups, or organizations, that one becomes disproportionately more well known than the others.
Here's where the straw man is most clear, because Wes never mentions anything about the supernatural. Instead, what did he say?
Later.
Yeah.
In that there are other messianic movements in the ancient world, but I bet you couldn't name any of the individuals involved in those. And there's a reason why we're asking questions about Jesus of Nazareth and not Simon Bar Kokhba. And that's because Simon Bar Kokhba led a revolt and died, and his movement died with him. And so I think there's something unique about the movement of Jesus that requires an explanation for what's going on. Because
popularity can explain why people flocked to the movement of Simon Bar Kokhba when he was alive, and his death can explain why the movement ended. The problem with explaining Christianity is that the popularity argument works similarly only at the beginning. But it also means that if Jesus died, then the movement should have ended. Why? This is because Jesus' death was imposed by both the religious and the political authorities, by both the Jews and the Romans. This was a thoroughgoing rejection of not just Jesus, but also his teaching. So it doesn't matter how popular it might have been before he died. In the honor culture of the ancient Near East, for both elements of the state to act so decisively, told people that this simply was not an acceptable position to hold or someone acceptable to follow. Bar Kokhba's revolt, on the other hand, at least had some measure of endorsement from the surviving religious authority at the time. So the popularity argument from a cultural and historical perspective simply just does not pass the smell test. But again, Wes says nothing about the supernatural. He's simply dealing with the historical reality. Bar Kokhba was moving, ended at his death. Why didn't Jesus ascend? Now, Paul tries to make a connection by throwing in a number of pop culture references to technology and entertainment, but we aren't talking about personal computers or Star Wars. And it's not that one became more well known or disappeared into historical obscurity like 7th century contemporaries and rivals of Prophet Muhammad or contemporaries and rivals with Buddha. Nor does bringing up 19th century heterodox and heretical movements. It's that it has a reason for not just why it has continued for 2,000 years, but that it was even able to get off the ground to begin with, given the scandal of having your leader publicly executed by both the religious and the political authorities. Popularity just fails as an explanation. Also, Paul, you're really showing your age when you mention Logan's Run or Buck Rogers. No one under the age of 45 is going to get that. And yes, Paul, I know where you got all those names because I can use Wikipedia too.
Because we see the disciples scared and hiding when the crucifixion event takes place.
We don't see that, Wes. That the disciples were scared and hiding is something claimed by the Gospels. It is not a fact to be explained.
So Paul clearly does not know the difference between a claim and a fact when it comes to the analysis of historical data. Indeed, it is a claim for Wes to say the disciples were scared and in hiding. And the source for verifying that claim, which establishes it as a fact, is where? That's right. That's right. It's in our primary historical sources, the Gospels. Now, Paul, you've got a problem because you've made a historical counterclaim, even if it's just by implication, that you've got to prove. And you've got to produce some primary historical source to justify the claim. You just can't throw it out there and walk away. You now bear the burden of proof. So, just going back through to Wes's claim, though, this is what is known as a claim of fact. What is a claim of fact, you might ask? Well, a claim of fact is a statement based on objective, verifiable evidence rather than personal opinion or moral judgment. Wes wasn't stating an opinion. He wasn't making a moral judgment. He was making a statement based upon objective, verifiable historical evidence in the form of the historical literary text we call the Gospels. Now, the fact that Paul doesn't like where Paul is getting this information from is simply irrelevant. And if you can't see it, Paul, maybe you should go see an eye doctor. Ironically, though, Paul actually undercuts himself. So just listen very carefully here.
Because we see the disciples scared and hiding when the crucifixion event takes place.
We don't see that, Wes. That the disciples were scared and hiding is something claimed by the Gospels. It is not a fact to be explained.
So which is it? Is it a claim or is it a fact? This is what I'm talking about when I point out that the sword that Paul is swinging actually cuts both ways. Because if it's merely a claim, then you should be able to present evidence to disprove it. But if it's a fact, then that does require explanation. Why would the disciples have been afraid? Did they have a reason to be afraid or not? And where we get this knowledge is essentially irrelevant from a historical standpoint. And it's from this point that things start to take a very interesting turn, to say the least.
The disciples, the 11 of them, because Judas has gone and hung himself, are hiding in an upper room, scared and cowering. What takes them from that to being this incredible missionary force? To be able to go back into Jerusalem on something like the day of Pentecost, proclaiming the resurrection to a group of people who very well could have seen Jesus crucified.
Now, I want to pause here because I want to let a little bit of tension build. Just a little bit, just to get us ready for something that's awkward. No funny editing tricks. I'm just going to back up just a few seconds from before where Paul pauses Wes's comments. Listen carefully.
Could have seen Jesus crucified.
Here's where we can start branching out from the Bible to see what we have. In the authentic letters of Paul,
What? Listen to that one more time.
here's where we can start branching out from the Bible to see what we have. In the authentic letters of Paul,
Where are these authentic letters of Paul found? Oh, what's it called? What? Oh, right! It's called the Bible. But wasn't Paul just mocking Wes for appealing to the Bible? Yes, I can be petty too. Anyway,
Could have seen Jesus crucified.
here's where we can start branching out from the Bible to see what we have. In the authentic letters of Paul, we learned that 2 of these 11 men, Peter and John, presumably the son of Zebedee, are active in the church. That's it. That's all. That leaves 9 men that Wes is claiming were proclaiming resurrection without a shred of evidence that these 9 acknowledged the resurrection, experienced anything at all from Jesus after he died, that these 9 spent a single minute preaching it. These 9 dropped from reliable history.
now Paul's made a number of claims here. And I just want to make sure we get them noted. First of all, he notes there are 2 named disciples in the authentic letters of Paul. Note that, authentic letters of Paul, which is just a completely arbitrary term. And then Paul says there are 2 specific named disciples, Peter and John, and these 2 are the only ones active in the church. Now, he makes a couple other claims, but I want to focus on these because the neat thing is we can test just this claim right here, right quick. Let me grab my phone. We'll walk through this claim here right quick. All right, this is one of my favorite Bible apps right here. We're just going to do a quick search here. Type in, let's see, Peter. Oh, wait a second. I better do a bracketed search to make sure we get the right results. Peter and John. All right, search. Okay. Luke Acts. All right, we got to change our result tree. Back them out here. Let's just do highlight Paul's epistles only. And research. Oh!
Houston, we have a problem.
I would say that we do have a problem, Houston. I mean, did Paul actually think that no one would go behind him and check on him? No. Paul made a claim and the facts simply refute the claim. So this is a problem for Paul because he's just been caught being, is this a mistake or is he being blatantly deceptive? See, I can dance on that line too. This takes us back to the first part of the search where if you're paying attention, centers the mentions of Peter and John, where exactly? Well, that's right. It put them in Luke and Acts. And what do we get in Acts? We get a list of disciples, not just 11, though 11 are named. We're told that the group consisted of roughly 120 people. And what does it say in the beginning of chapter 1, verse 21? Now, this is about when Judas is being replaced. So one of the men who have accompanied us during all the time the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day when he was taken up from us, one of these men must become with us a witness to his resurrection. Interesting. And he goes on to name 2 men, one of whom takes the place of Judas. And notice the requirement before any of these people can be considered. They have to have accompanied us from the time that Jesus was baptized with John until the day that he ascended. Now, when you go to chapter 2, what happens? All of them begin to preach. Now, you can set aside the supernatural acts that are described there and just look at what happens. They all begin to preach. Then narratively, Luke begins to pare down his narrative focus to an instant with Peter and John, and then just Peter, and then eventually he switches his focus just to Paul. And he shifts the narrative spot, and the shift in the narrative spotlight doesn't mean that any of the others stopped proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. Now, here's the neat thing. I could stop this video right here because it doesn't really matter what Paul says after this. And it's going to sound really harsh, and it's because, and I believe it should sound harsh. It's a fabrication. It's a rather blatant error that invalidates essentially all of his criticism. It's a simple, well, let's just say it's just a simple mistake, but it wrecks his credibility. And unless he pulls down his video and is willing to issue an apology to his viewers for such a obvious mistake, or he's just being dishonest. Now, that's something I've noted he has a tendency for, but he won't do it. Why? Because of the sycophants in his comment section. That's why. They'll let him get away with it because they won't check on it. I'm being too harsh? Maybe. I don't know. Maybe I am. Like I said, I could just stop the video here, but I won't. Actually, I am going to stop the video right here because if you want to watch the rest of it, you've got to head over to Rumble. The rest of the video will be linked in the description. Go right over to Rumble and pick up watching there. Hey, again, I'm Triggerman1976. Thanks for watching this video. If this is, again, like this is your first time here, please hit that like button. Again, if you're a returning viewer but you're not already subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. Don't forget, you can follow me on X and Instagram at Triggerman1976, all of which are linked in the description in the link tree. So head down there, click on the link tree, you can follow me there. Also, you can find links to my blogs, all of which, like I said, is down there in the link tree, as well as my bookstore, where you can find resources like Richard Burridge's What Are the Gospels. Be sure and check it out. Again, Triggerman1976, thanks for watching. God bless. Now, get over to Rumble and watch the rest of this video.